Order. Well, I did not make the comment.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers, he is the political columnist for the NBR, political consultant, commentator and moral shepherd of the right, Matthew Hooton. And he is the associate professor at the School of Communication Studies at AUT, media oracle, Dr. Wayne Hope. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1. John Key releases his latest 10-point plan for the country's public services. Are his aspirations realistic or ridiculous? Issue 2, Labour strikes back. Cunliffe's third speech given in West Auckland is aimed at stemming the voter flow to the Greens. Will it succeed? In issue 3, what now for public broadcasting with TVNZ 7 shut down in 2 days' time? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off with tonight's issue 1. John Key's 10-point plan for New Zealand's public service this week, and not the same 10 points he released in March, which followed Stephen Joyce's 6 key areas for business growth, which was a subset of the 4 main priorities Key outlined at the beginning of the year, but they weren't the same 4 priorities outlined by the 6-point economic plan rolled out in 2010, which were different again from these 6 points of broader focus off the National Party campaign billboards, and which have little to do with the 120-point economic action plan announced at last year's election. Matthew, I don't wish to sound cynical, but this 10-point plan stuff, is it just fluff for the news cycle to look like the government are actually doing something?
Oh, well, this was all announced in John Key's big speech back in February. Remember, he and David Shearer gave speeches on the same day, and they both underwhelmed. This is like something out of the Soviet Union. You know, these sort of quantitative targets, there will be exactly 600 fewer prisoners, not 599 or 601, but 600 fewer prisoners on a particular date in the future. I mean, it does remind me of the sort of parable, I guess, of the shoe factory in East Germany, where they were told they had to produce, say, 10 million shoes, so they produced 10 million left-footed shoes because it was easier, and they said, no, you have to make pairs. So they said, okay, we'll make pairs next year. So they made pairs, but they're all size 10 because it was cheaper and easier to hit the target if you just make. I mean, what the government needs to do is design a clear policy program. When you focus on outcomes like this, who says that you want 67% or 85% of 16-year-olds to be at level 2 of the NCEA? Who says that's the priority? And what it does is distorts investment into, in that case, level 2 of the NCEA.
Sure.
I mean, the government says it wants everyone to be able to read, write and do arithmetic by the time they leave secondary school.
Which is a noble goal.
Well, then your target should be 100% of students reach level 1.
Sure.
But actually, if you're interested in fueling economic growth, your target would probably be more about level 4, level 5. So why we're focused on level 2 of the NCEA, which is itself a sort of Soviet-style system. This is a joke. It's absolute nonsense, and it is what you'd expect from a far-left party rather than from the National Party.
Wayne, one of the goals is 45,000 fewer crimes in 5 years. Will that be made up by freezing police wages, spinning crime stats, or in the case of domestic violence, not recording them at all? How are we going to get to these goals?
Well, this is Monty Python's Flying Circus, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
The key problem with these goals is that there's no macroeconomic context,
Right.
and there's no argument about macroeconomic change. So if you look at the unemployed numbers that they want to get down,
Sure,
and they want to get them off the welfare rolls, what if the Eurozone has imploded by then? And unemployment's gone through the roof because our banks have raised their interest rates.
Sure.
And the whole macroeconomic situation is rather difficult. I mean, are the people running social welfare still going to get performance targets?
Right.
It's not quite like the Soviet Union because the performance targets are actually for increasing poverty rather than trying to alleviate it, even though the USSR did it in a very statist and undemocratic way.
Yeah.
Although they did manage to increase poverty dramatically over
Yeah, they did a great
years
job.
as
They did a
well,
great
so-
job of that.
Well, John Key's done a great job too.
Yeah, he's not too bad off that. Are these? Who are these for? Is it for is it for the audience at home who want to see John Key doing something, or is it actually for the public service?
I've got no idea. I mean, the government's under pressure at the moment. They would have been better served not to announce anything like this. Why would you do it? 2017? I mean, that's just picking a number out of the year, out of the air, isn't it?
Do you think he'll get beaten or he'll receive any flack if they don't make the targets, or are they so far in the future it just doesn't matter?
Oh, I think people's short-term memory loss from watching, tabloid news every day is such that people will have forgotten the targets were made.
Matthew, the government wants 23,000 fewer long-term beneficiaries on its books by 2017. Does that mean we'll see or we'll have bonuses for cutting off claimants like we've seen at ACC expanded into social welfare the way they have in America? Is that where this is moving?
I think you're failing to see that the whole thing's nonsense.
Am I taking it too seriously?
Yeah, you are. If next summer, for example, we have another wet, hot summer and the grass grows, then there will be very, very strong economic growth like there was in the first quarter of this year.
Positives of global warming?
The strongest growth for 5 years happened because of the weather, basically, in New Zealand. Now, if we continue to have good growth in the dairy industry and the economy grows faster than expected, then this target will be met easily.
Sure.
Right? Alternatively, if there is and this is what you're saying about the macroeconomic context, if alternatively there is a global meltdown, then it won't be met. But you see, it will be met. All these targets, don't get me wrong, they'll all be achieved. For example, the ones in education, if necessary, they'll be achieved by the standards being increased or decreased in order to ensure that the...
You think they'll be that manipulated?
Well, this is what tends to happen in a situation like this. So that the bureaucracy will be absolutely incentivised to ensure that these are achieved. Or they'll be redefined so that they are achieved. Although, having said that, I don't believe anybody in 5 years' time is going to remember this. So I don't think it's...
One of these aspirations is to reduce rheumatic fever by 2/3. But seeing as rheumatic fever is primarily a poverty disease and connected to poor housing, how on earth does that aspiration mix with the realities of welfare cutbacks and 0800 state house help numbers for a segment of society that doesn't actually have phones?
Well, not only is there no macroeconomic context, there's no social policy context either. You're quite right, some of these diseases are diseases of poverty, as Susan St John and others have pointed out. And it needs a wider brief to look at them. And the other thing too is that immunisation rates, if you want those to improve, then you've got to spend money on public health provision. Rather than increasing charges for going to see your GP, who might pick them up if you could afford to go there.
Yeah. Question to both of you on this final list of goals. Secret briefing papers to Stephen Joyce today show the government's 100,000 promised new jobs will largely go to highly skilled professional males. Has Jobs for the Boys become actual policy now?
In this economy, you'd hope that job creation is for highly skilled people. One of the problems with our economy at the moment is that it's growing in low-skilled areas, like tourism. It's surely good news that we expect if there is to be job growth in the economy, it's going to be high-skilled jobs.
Rich white old men, they're the ones who are lined up for the jobs. That's okay?
Educated men too. Let's just say that is a laudable goal. Then why has the government made it tougher to pay back loans for postgraduate degrees?
Right.
That's just driving people to Australia. I mean, as someone who works in the tertiary sector, I've had a number of students come up to me saying, wow, I'm glad this wasn't in when I did my PhD or my Masters, otherwise I wouldn't be able to afford it.
Wow.
So on the one hand, you've got the government actually wanting to invest in skilled labour, educated labour, and jobs and so on. But then other policies in education are undercutting all of that. So it's just contradictory, really.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, the tension has been building between the Greens and Labor for the last couple of months and boiled over last week with the Greens' success over ACC and Grant and Kennedy's rumble over trips to Rio. At some point, Labor was going to have to address the plucky new Green challenger, and David Cunliffe's third speech given on the weekend was aimed at re-establishing Labor's Green credentials. Did it work? Wayne Cunliffe used language that out-apocalypsed the Greens in terms of staking out the dangers from resource collapse and climate change. Will this do enough to slow the losses from Labor to Greens?
No, not really. He's outlined clearly the consequences of global climate change if nothing is done. But what he hasn't done is ask the hard political questions and look at the causes of human-induced climate change. And we've got a polluter-pays situation there. If you look at scientists like James Hansen and others, what they clearly identify is that the major contributors to human-induced climate change are actually large fossil fuel companies,
Right.
oil companies,
Right.
and so on. So you have to identify the culprits. If things are as apocalyptic as Cunliffe suggests,
Yeah.
then it would be logical, wouldn't it, to identify who are the major contributors to all of this, and that's precisely what you don't see in his speech.
Right.
By contrast, the Greens are not scared to take on prickly, controversial topics,
Yep.
and they will identify. Let me give you another example of where Labor pulls their punches on environmental issues.
Yeah.
I was looking up on this and I looked at one of Brendan Burns' statements from last year, and he says Labor's policy is, quote, we'll have an investigation into the pros and cons of deep sea oil
Yeah,
drilling.
that's right.
Well, there's a lot of evidence in already that suggests that the risk factors are actually very, very high indeed. So the Green position is just simply say we're prepared to invest in shallow oil drilling, but not in deep sea waters, right? So that's our clear position. Labor doesn't have a clear position like that. So behind all the extreme rhetoric, Labor's actual position on green issues is quite equivocal.
Matthew, Labor have to do something about the environment, don't they? One of the most telling moments in the 2008 debate between John Key and Helen Clark was when Key reeled off the appalling environmental record under Labor's 9 years. Is Cunliffe's attempt in vain?
I don't think this has anything whatsoever to do with the Green Party. I think this is just a totally transparent attempt to try and undermine David Shearer's leadership.
Really?
This is the third speech he's given like this. He's an incredibly arrogant individual who believes that the wrong choice was made when Shearer became leader.
Oh, well, many members do believe that as
And
well, though.
Well, it does look as if David Shearer's about to become Prime Minister in two and a bit years' time, so, there you go. I mean, it was just 7,044 words of enviro-alarmist twaddle. He says that no one believes that the world can sustain 9 billion people. Well, a lot of people do, actually. And I think one of the difficulties that he has is that for this sort of alarmist nonsense, the planet isn't cooperating. And the planet isn't warming to the extent that he claims, and the seas aren't rising. And the high point of extremist enviro-alarmism is now behind us. And there's a more rational view of these issues. The UN's IPCC says that the maximum sea level rise expected over the next century is 59 centimetres. Well, that doesn't quite fit with the image of everyone drowning and so forth that I think he's trying to sum up in this speech. So a stupid speech, really, and I think he's making a fool of himself because Labor is moving up in the polls. David Shearer is most likely to become Prime Minister with the Greens after the next election, and this silly man is going around undermining his party just when it's starting to succeed.
You do know that there is a lot of angst within Labor regarding the Greens and their rise and success. You don't think they should see that as a threat?
Well, no, because they are rivals, but they're also allies. And as I say, the high point of enviro-extremist alarmism is over. Helen Clark presumably did polling and so forth and came up with that speech in her 2007 or 2008 conference. And she said, let's make New Zealand the world's first carbon neutral nation. And presumably that she only said that because her pollsters said it would be popular, and her pollsters are excellent, and I'm sure they're correct. I think if a politician made such a preposterous claim or goal now, they'd be laughed at.
Right.
And so, I think he's out of date. He really hasn't moved on since he left the Boston Consulting Group.
Wayne, how does Labor compete with the Greens for votes?
Well, can I just reply to what Matthew said?
Oh, sure.
He seems to really have it in for David Cunliffe.
Oh, he does every time he's on
No,
the show.
I like David Cunliffe. I just think it's sad he's not knuckling down and doing his job.
Attacking David Cunliffe is more a hobby than a profession, but he enjoys it.
I thought we were talking about issues here, like an ad hominem attack is like, he's a silly man. I mean,
We do.
Well, it is, no, that's not ad
well.
hominem.
We do blood
to
sport
go
as well.
round, just as your party is starting to succeed, giving silly speeches, that makes you a silly person. It means you're not part of the Labor Party team.
Well, Grant Robertson was there, making sure it was a team event.
Grant Robertson was there to keep an eye on him. I think we all know.
Can I ask you a question then? Would Matthew prefer that David Shearer became the new Prime Minister? Is that what's going on here?
Well, I don't make any comment on that. What I'm saying is that's where it looks as if Labor is heading. It's moving up progressively in the polls. as are the Greens. Both those two parties are moving up in the polls.
Although it could,
and they're
it could-
starting
it-
to
it-
look as
it-
if they might form a government. So
It
what's
could-
he
it could-
doing?
It could be argued,
undermining the
though,
party
it-
leadership.
It could be argued, though, that the polls are rising despite Shearer, not because of him. And there have been many, many critiques of Shearer's performances on television to date. And the only one he's really sort of nailed was the backbenchers performance.
And you in
against
your
the
blog
Party.
said that was the night he became
That's
Prime
right,
Minister.
that's right.
And you
Well,
might be right.
that was the
But,
moment.
you know, whatever the cause of Labor's increase in the polls, it is increasing in the polls, as are the Greens.
Yep.
And so giving Enviro extremists 7,000-word speeches to undermine the leadership isn't a good idea.
How does Labor compete with the Greens for the votes?
Well, this won't do it.
Yeah,
Because as I said before, it's high on rhetoric and it's low on substance.
yeah.
I think when you look at the climate change issue, at one end of the continuum we've got alarmists,
Yep.
and I agree with Matthew, there are some alarmists about
Yep.
who haven't done their homework.
Yep.
And at the other end of the continuum we've got denialists.
Totally.
And these are people who are at the same intellectual level as creationists.
And Gina Reinhardt would be in that group.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, what Cunliffe's done here is he's identified not the most extreme scenarios, but some of the most disturbing scenarios that
Yep.
can have some scientific support. Okay. But then he hasn't identified causes. I mean,
Sure.
I agree with Matthew when he says it's ridiculous just to look at population increase.
Yeah.
Because I'm one of those people who think that population increases can be absorbed
Sure.
with proper land ownership, environmental policies and so on. I've never been one of these survivalist Ehrlich type people back in the early 60s, the Club of Rome stuff where the population goes up like this, and then as it goes up and up and up, we're in a worse and worse situation. That's just
You weren't building bunkers.
no, that's simplistic twaddle. You've got to look at the relations of power, and the key issue, which hasn't properly been addressed here, is that large fossil fuel corporations are the biggest polluters and contributors to climate change. And there's a really key issue here. People say the oil's running out. It's not. It's the easy to get oil that's
Sure.
running out.
Yeah.
And the big problem is that the oil companies are moving into oil shales, say, in northern Canada,
Yep.
and that stuff is more polluting and more climate warming than the easy to get oil.
Sure.
So it makes the problem of global warming exponentially worse, and that's the real problem here.
Yeah.
So if Cunliffe is partly right about the scenario, then he's also got to be honest about the causes, and I think he's pulled punches, and the Greens are much further ahead on this.
What would your advice be to Labor in terms of having a clear direction that's not green, that they won't be cannibalised by the Green Party?
Well, just at the moment they're running this issue on the mixed ownership model, the
Yep.
issue of these 3% of shares or 3% of the government's balance sheet is going to be put on the stock exchange.
Yep.
And that's going well for them. I think they'll probably lose some momentum on that issue. I think in the end the asset sales or the share issues will be popular when they come down to it. That's the experience when Winston Peters privatised Auckland International
Yep.
Airport,
Yep.
and also with Contact Energy. When it actually happens, it's quite popular and it creates media around that. But you know,
Unless it's a Facebook launch,
you can't.
going to be held apart.
Well, that's right. And the
Right,
government, that's
yeah,
the big
yeah.
risk the
Yeah,
government has.
yeah,
They've got to get
yeah,
the
yeah,
pricing
gotta
right.
get it right, gotta get it-
for
can't
both
overblow it.
economic, financial,
Sure,
and
sure,
political
sure, sure.
reasons. But look, I mean, if you're going up in the polls, your coalition partner's also going up in the polls, so you're not taking one another's vote,
Yep.
and your main opponent is falling in the polls. It's a bit arrogant for any of us to start giving them advice on what they should do differently.
Sure.
You know, elections in the end, if you're a politician, they're about winning.
Very interesting on iPredict over this week for the first time in iPredict's history. National under 40%.
Yeah, and the polls, you know, have National in the mid-40s, but iPredict is suggesting National has further to fall. National, I think, under scenarios can still form a
Yep,
government.
that's right.
Winston Peters, of course, will always go with National if he has a choice in this situation. So if National were to get 40% of the vote, Winston Peters to get 5% of the vote.
And Conservative Party
And
4.
well, yeah, and of course, National argued to keep the threshold at
Yes,
5%.
yes, they
Labor
did.
argued to reduce it to 4%.
Yep.
I think we'll find National and Labor will both swap one another's positions.
Final question, both of you. Will Russell Norman be the next Minister of Finance?
Oh, it depends on the percentage of the vote.
Sure.
What I can say is that on financial and macroeconomic matters, he's outperformed any other politician.
Sure.
So whatever happens, he'll be a major force in the election campaign.
Russell, Finance Minister 2014?
Well, that's clearly his aspiration.
Yeah.
You know, part of me thinks that Labor will once again if they have the choice,
Screw them.
screw them.
Right,
And they'll
yeah,
say,
yeah.
look, you've got nowhere to go. There's no way we're making you finance minister. If you don't like it, what we're offering you, which is Minister of Consumer Affairs and Minister of Conservation,
Yep.
then go and talk to the Nats.
Sure.
But, you know, I think if Labor does that, that would create long-term problems for them. But you know, it's going to be a big call, because to make Russell Norman finance minister would lead to an immediate collapse in the property market and into
Listen to-
in the dollar. You'd see
Now, that's
Economic
interest rates
alarmist.
rise.
That's economic
yes,
alarmist,
yes,
isn't
we-
it?
yeah,
I think
yeah,
the
yeah.
signal on that.
That's
Four
really
horsemen,
hard.
the
negative.
four horsemen of the apocalypse.
Now, when we're talking about alarmism,
Yeah.
it's,
Thank you, panel. Thank you,
That's how
panel.
they'd respond. The
Moving
markets
on with
respond.
issue 3. In 2 days' time, TVNZ7 gets cut off, and the last public broadcaster on nationwide access gets killed off. I've been hosting the Safe TVNZ7 meetings around the country over the last month, and Dr. Wayne Hope has been a guest speaker at some of those meetings. Matthew wasn't invited. But where to from here for public broadcasting? Matthew, who really killed off TVNZ7? Was it merely disinterest on the government's behalf, or homicidal intent by TVNZ? Because TVNZ admitted very early on that they didn't bother promoting TVNZ7 because they feared it would eat into their own ratings base.
Well, they seem to think overall it was a cost to them. And that it was never going to make a profit for them, and so that's why they made this decision. I mean, the idea TVNZ as a public broadcaster is absurd. We're in a very strange country where it's the foreign-owned TV3 that acts more as a public broadcaster than the state-owned state-owned TVNZ. I mean, in the end, what will be driving these decisions, and what should have led to the sale of TVNZ more than 10 years ago, is the fact that media institutions, particularly in television, have no long-term future and no value in them, because it is content that is king, and content will be delivered direct to the viewer, not through a channel, whether it's TVNZ, TV3, TVNZ7, or even Sky. And if you take a long-term view of broadcasting, therefore, you want to get the hell out of owning assets which are about distribution.
Wayne, the broadcasting minister said in Parliament this week that the government would not reserve a frequency for public broadcasting, but under the Ministry of Economic Development, they're obliged to, aren't they?
I'm not sure about that, but one thing I do know is that if the appropriate government was elected in the next election, it's actually not all that difficult to redesignate TVNZ7 to be a public service channel again, to get the appropriate frequency from the Ministry of Economic Development. To reintroduce something like the Charter, put somebody more public broadcasting orientated on the board, refunction the purpose of New Zealand On Air. And if broadcasting has a high portfolio rating, which traditionally it hasn't with either party, and if there's an electoral mandate to advance public television, public broadcasting, then all of these things can be done quite easily. It's just a matter of whether there's a political will.
Well, then it becomes something that's subsidised, like the Symphony Orchestra or the New Zealand Ballet, because it's seen as something that people think they should happen.
Actually, it's interesting you should mention that, because in the talks we've done around New Zealand, had a number of National Party, not members, but voters come up to me and say, you know, they like watching the history of science documentaries and so on. I thought, well, this is interesting, because there is bipartisan support for TVNZ7 in the same way that there is for the Friends of the Concert Program and so on. So in many ways, this is not just a left-right issue.
No.
I mean, if you're a high school teacher and you want to use one of those history of science docos to run your class, it doesn't matter whether that high school teacher votes for National, ACT, Labor, Green or New Zealand First. It's taking that program off air is actually damaging our public knowledge, no matter where you lie in the political spectrum.
The content is still coming down the Sky pipe, and the internet is. Interestingly enough, I mean, I think probably the program I found most interesting on TVNZ7 was Russell Brown's Media 7 program. I thought that was a good piece of public broadcasting content. TV3 has taken that up. And, you know, it is a debate about content and channel and distribution, and if I was the government at the moment, I wouldn't want to be owning distribution networks.
Well, final question on that then. Now it's no longer a public broadcaster. Will TVNZ be an asset on the block for sale?
Well, it's probably not worth anything, because it doesn't really have, that type of company doesn't really have a long-term future. I mean, I think there was still some value in it in the late 90s, and the government should have sold it then. Now, it's probably not worth anything, and it'll just slowly fade away and die.
TVNZ going to be on? Will they try and sell it?
I just want to bring up a historical point here. Before TVNZ was restructured for sale by the
Yep.
Shipley government, it had a 16% share in Sky TV.
Yes.
Had a terrific revenue stream which could have helped fund public service broadcasting. Now, even though that was the situation then, the national government just wiped it and restructured the place with the help from Roseanne Mayo, and that was the situation. So it's clear that TVNZ7 was in reasonable financial health at the time that it was being divvied up for sale. Incidentally, I do agree with Matthew that there probably wouldn't be a buyer, but that's all the more reason to refunction TVNZ in a public service direction, because all the infrastructure is there, right? The studios, it's about connecting up with program makers rather than just being a Saatchi and Saatchi organisation.
Let's run the show with final word. Wayne, your final word this week is?
Well, there are some KPI indicators we talked about at the start, right? Getting crime numbers down, getting people off welfare rolls down. Here's another KPI indicator. We want to, I'm a member of the government now, we want to increase the percentage of voicemail messages that welfare clients get and other public service clients get compared to face-to-face messages on the phone. I think, because that's a sign of efficiency, isn't it?
It is.
The greater percentage of voicemail replies you get, as opposed to those from real people, it means that public services generally and welfare are going in the right direction.
Our war with Eurasia is almost over. Matt, what would your final word this week be?
Well, there's an interesting thing that happened in Parliament today from Phil Twyford from the Labor Party, asking questions in Parliament about this integrated ticketing system in Auckland. And the suggestion being that there was some sort of political interference
That's right.
back in the first term of the government that's caused a delay or some problems with the project. I think that's a story that's going to grow. I think the one of the things about the government is very hands-on, very activist.
That's right.
So it did things like the Warner Brothers deal that you can say, well, that was justifiable arguably, or the MediaWorks deal, justifiable arguably, even Sky City, there's a point of view there. But I don't like to use slippery slope arguments, but I think the government needs to be very careful of some of the closeness of its relationships with some people in the business community, because governments should, well, not in our country, I mean, maybe in France it's okay for governments to be sort of corporatist like this and connected with the business community, but I think it's better in New Zealand that there has been a separation between policy and business decisions.
Is Stephen Joyce in trouble?
Well, I don't know if that's the case, but he was Minister of Transport.
That's right.
At some of the times where Auckland Transport and New Zealand Transport Authority seemed to be making decisions which were unwise with the benefit of hindsight.
We'll take that as a yes. He could be in trouble. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Matthew. Ladies and gentlemen, my final word. Secret briefing papers, Stephen Joyce, showed the government's 100,000 promised new jobs will largely go to rich white men. Key has been boasting these 100,000 jobs as his commitment to employment. But when the majority of them are going to people like him, it has the whiff of venal self-interest gone septic. I can see why the briefings were secret. Jobs for the boys as actual state policy is about as alienating as Paul Henry on Australian breakfast television. Beyond the jokes, however, is an angry question. If the tax cuts have benefited the rich and wealthy, if the asset sales will benefit the rich and the wealthy, and now employment policy is benefiting the rich and the wealthy, what the bloody hell does this government do for the remaining majority? The answer seems to be farcical 10-point plans to nowhere. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Don't forget my new show, The Union Report, plays 8 p.m. Monday nights here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Thanks for watching whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see